Hi there, welcome to 45 Hours to Singularity. I'm Dom, and this is my future. Now before we start, what is 45 Hours to Singularity? Well, it's a mixture of fiction and discussion. A conversation between me and you on what we think the future might be like. Every video will start with a short story that's been written by me, and the basis of each short story is going to be that it takes place in the 45 hours leading up to the actual singularity. That each video will be a mix of a short story and also a conversation between you and me on what we think the future is going to be like. Okay, let's begin. And the first story is called The Wooden Boy, hour 45. And he would be made of wood. This child's story cycled unknown and harmlessly in the old man's subconscious. Whether it was a motivator or a symptom of the man's needs was up for question. But it was there, and it drove him on as his fingers traced circles of light in the hologram wrapped around him. This esoteric aura projected all around the old man and represented the potential for thought, for memory, for personality. It was a cocoon for an artificial mind, a glowing robe of a soul waiting to be born and stubbornly remaining stillborn. Despite the man's best efforts to construct something beautiful. Despite the man's age, his hands danced with surety and grace. His body was sustained now by a range of chemical, physical implants to ward off age. His ARC or arc implant felt warm against the base of his skull, and however much input his hands created, the implant fed a multitude more into the angelic form around him. Data and responses pummeled the image, twisting it, bending the configuration to breaking point, but never pushing out of the computer's parameters. The old man refused to give up on this concept. He had known this was the way for decades. He had been a prophet until 15 years before, when his theories collapsed around him, and all too soon his detractors had poured scorn on his modelling of the future. The Kool-Aid faithful had remained with him for several years, but as the world raced on with no sight of the metaphorical Messiah appearing, they too had slowly drifted away. By the time it was realised that the children of ones and zeros had already arrived, all right in a much more restricted form, the old man was another casualty of one of his own buzzwords, disruptive change. So, he toiled on with his concept. He would no longer be a prophet, and his focus had sprung instead to becoming the parent. A corona of light spun around him this night as the subconscious impulse spurred him on. When the reality of AI had begun to impact on all forms of human interaction, he had finally expected his validation and acceptance. As the reality played out that the computer intelligences were far more bureaucratic and distant from human concerns and emotions than humanity could warm to, well, they were sidelined as complex algorithms. They were helpful, but not truly sentient. The old man suspected that whilst this was the mainstream view, the line had long blurred. He found much to agree with on the media of conspiracy theorists who claimed that these digital phantasms embedded in the world of politics, security and finance had coalesced into a much more aware form of intelligence than the blind, dumb, single-use algorithms that had populated the world 20 years ago. But by then, it was too late. The lights continued to flare and dim with each week, each plea for something to respond, some indication that he was on the right track, that he could create life and thought in this cocoon of digital fire. The old man closed his eyes, breathing heavily through his nostrils in an effort to calm himself. His agitation was purely mental. His physical structure was now so modified that he felt reasonably sanguine about reaching his 102nd birthday. He knew he was still on that escape velocity from death, and that each year survived meant it was possible to live just 1 year more. 1 more year to prove himself to the memories of those that he had loved the most. Loved and lost. 1 more year to be right. The aura of light dimmed to a ghostly pallor, and the man stepped out into a darkness that bore the atmosphere of failure. He settled on a chair, took a strong mug of coffee from a nearby server unit. The world around him was saturated with digital intelligence, or perhaps more correctly, infected with digital stupidity. The closest that existed to intelligence had shut out mankind from its decision-making. Black box AI, as they were known, used at the highest level of business and government now. Every day, people assumed their leaders knew what was being planned and discussed with the BBs. But the old man suspected that more and more human and black box existed side by side and diverged a little more each year. The old man had specialized in predicting the future, had prided himself on his ability until he had been proved almost wrong. 2045 was the crunch year, and it had been 2045 for a few months now. The dormant digital halo hung in the middle of his room, a residual projection of his ARC implant. Augmented reality computer, a device created by another visionary earlier in the century. A man who paid the ultimate price of the visionary prophet. He was gunned down in his own factory by one of his own workers, accused of perverting the human design. The rise of religious Luddites was all too easy to predict, all too difficult to argue against. The right of humanity to passively believe in divinity instead of actively seeking to create it. Admittedly, early ARC implants caused emotional dysfunction and mania in users, but the rapid development of insertion technology and more sophisticated neural connections reduced rejection rates to almost nil. General public acceptance of the technology, outside of countries and communities with fundamental religious ideologies, was comparable to the uptake of mobile phone technology in the early 2000s. It was now approaching 80% of the Western adult population. Early years of dehumanization had been swiftly poo-pooed by a slick marketing campaign from the USA and Chinese major technology companies. Alibaba had been the global leader, with its augmented reality marketplace templates to allow you to wander. It could be a virtual Eastern bazaar or a clinical style Apple store to view your possible purchases. The neural links allowed for limited touch, aroma, even taste in the virtual environment. It took less than 2 weeks for the major pornography providers to copy the template, and suddenly ARC owners could virtually roam an online brothel, every sexual act imaginable available and, to a limited extent, consciously experienced behind one locked portal or another. Strangely, at a time when one's darkest fantasies could be experienced in the recesses of the limbic system, the boom in morphing sex robots really took off, and they became as acceptable as a vibrator in a suburban wife's family home. The only real victims of the latest sexual revolution were the streetwalkers. They either had to invest in a lot of ARC projection technology or were pushed to the far edges of prostitution, where the perversions and the dangers were at their most extreme. The old man broke out of his reverie, began to ready himself to leave for the night. The spectral light of the halo image gave him enough illumination to move through the room as his ARC compensated for the low light. At the door, he turned to look at the construct, hanging still in the room, willing it to be more than it was, a totem to his pride and vanity, a failed hope, a boy made of wood. The old man paused. Made of wood. What a strange thought! He shut the door behind him. His footsteps echoed faintly in the room as he moved away down the corridor. The halo construct flickered and persisted, just a moment longer than the receding signal from the ARC sustained it, before it too disappeared, leaving a faint digital echo in the darkness. Now, this is the 45th hour leading up to the Singularity. Initially I put an awful lot of different elements in there, but for me, the use of the ARC implant, I thought that was really important. This idea that we were going to be shunted into a virtual realm, and it was going to be commerce that led to that, finance, and of course a new sexual revolution. I thought that was a very important thing. In the past, the sex industry has been a huge driver of technological change, the most famous being that when, of course, the pornographic industry embraced the VHS format and not the Betamax format, killing off Betamax overnight. The last big theme that I threw in there was the idea that mankind creates the black box AI, the AI where we can look at it and not know what's going on inside it. And that, to me, is where AI gets really scary. That you set up the algorithms and the functions, but you don't actually know how the AI is using them to develop its processes. And it's a theme that I've come across so often on YouTube. So I would say that that is the biggest point of fear, that we're going to let the AI in to our security systems, into our financial systems, into our medical systems, and we won't understand 100% why they're doing what they're doing. And by the time we get to the 45 hours to Singularity, we actually find that the AI are controlling an awful lot more than mankind ever thought possible. So I'd like to say thank you so much for listening to the story and coming on board with some of the themes that I discussed there at the end. So I've got to say this, the next 25 years are going to be so exciting. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching and spending a little bit of time in my future.